Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another Solo Spooky Story. My name is Rob, and today I'll be your host. For those of you who don't know, the Solo Spooky Stories are stories every other week presented by myself, where I'll just talk about something that I find quite interesting, and, we'll just kind of not really come down to any sort of conclusion. And it's just a one-on-one between myself and you, the listener. So, yeah, it's just a fun, different way of doing things, and the episodes are generally shorter as well, which I know suits a lot of people. So, yeah, that's kind of the purpose of these ones every other week. But yeah, with that said, I hope you're having a lovely day whenever it is you're listening to this, and we'll just get into it. So today we are talking about a famous UFO case. It's actually quite famous. I'm sure a lot of you have already heard about this. But yeah, the Allagash UFO incident is, as I said, a very, very famous UFO case that has a really interesting kind of element to it that most UFO stories don't have. So this story, and we'll get into it more, but this story starts in 1976 and doesn't really come to the public knowledge until the late 80s, early 90s. And I think that's really the interesting thing about it, is that the people involved in this, they pretty much tried to go back to having normal lives for the longest time, and it was only through a series of events that occurred that we'll talk about that ultimately they ended up coming public and talking about what had happened to them, and in a sense were able to back up then what they were talking about. So it's a very interesting, and I would definitely say like a captivating story. You can make up your own mind whether or not you think it happened, but it's one of those ones that's quite well known in the UFO community, and you see it talked about a lot on various subreddits. There's multiple websites that talk about it as well. It's one of those ones that you just see come up a lot. There's a lot of like YouTube videos and such discussing it as well, and obviously a lot of podcasts. So it's pretty well known. So to start off, as I said, this starts in 1976 and it goes right through to, I'd say, the late 80s, early 90s, and then continues on into the present day. So there's kind of two parts to the story, and we'll talk about both of them today. To just give some, I suppose, a description of the area that we're talking about. This is the Allagash Wilderness Waterway, and it's in northern Maine. And back in the 1970s, this was a region of pretty kind of dense forest and extreme isolation, I suppose is the best way to put it. Like, if you wanted to go out here to get away from the world, this is what you would like. You could go here, and it's a really cool place. Pictures that you see online, like, it looks incredible. And the waterway itself, it comprises thousands of acres of dense forest. There's remote rivers then that go through this forested area, and then there's a number of lakes as well. The one that we're gonna be, I suppose, talking about or near today is Eagle Lake. And this lake is actually, it's accessible mostly by canoe or by plane. The float planes that land, it's accessible by that, which is very, very interesting. And that's a whole other terrifying thing all to itself, just landing a plane on water. I don't know if that's for me. And yeah, it's an interesting one. Anyway, we're not talking about that today. So the night really kind of changes this whole landscape, and it's described even by people who we're talking about today. They described it as a pitch black void, and I think that's fair to describe this area. Like, it's very, very far away from, I suppose, cities and things like that, and dense civilization. So you really are going to have like dark skies at night, and that really does kind of add, I think, to the whole, I suppose, claustrophobic feeling that these sort of places can put on people mentally, especially at nighttime. Like, it does dynamically change the landscape, and if you're not prepared for that, or in any way sort of uneasy with that, it could definitely lead to some different kind of feelings that you would have necessarily throughout the day when you've got the safety of the light showing you everything. But yeah, so 4 young art students were staying in the area. So Jack Weiner, Jim Weiner, who are identical twins, Charlie Fultz, and Chuck Rack. Just classic American names right there, all 4 of them. And the isolation that I talked about before, this was actually a major draw for these 4 students. They were pretty much looking for some sort of escape from urban life, and they wanted an opportunity to basically immerse themselves in the natural world. Presumably it's something to do with the fact that they're also art students, so maybe they're looking for some just kind of mental break from things, maybe some inspiration, or maybe a bit of both. Who's to know? But I suppose this environmental context, it's pretty critical for understanding, I suppose, the psychological atmosphere that the four of these guys were kind of finding themselves in, and then around the events that occurred afterwards. The isolation that they had basically imposed on themselves meant that they were miles from any sort of towns, phone lines, any sort of sources of modern interference, I suppose, is the best way to put it. Now, bear in mind it is the mid-70s, but even then, there would have been phones like readily available at that point and ways to communicate, and these four guys sought out that isolation. So it's difficult, basically, I think, to get out to the outside world where they are. And yeah, I suppose whether what we're going to talk about did actually happen or didn't, I think it's fair to say that the wilderness and the scenario that they found themselves in definitely kind of heightened their senses and potentially created, I suppose, the perfect storm for this kind of unusual or unexpected phenomena, and I suppose the psychological torment that it could potentially cause through stress and things like that. So they do talk about in later interviews that we will touch on that kind of cut off feeling from civilization is maybe an amplifying factor for the strangeness that they encountered, in that whatever happened to them, perhaps it happened because they were cut off from society. So we'll see. As we get to it, we'll talk about it and see what we think. So our story today starts in August 1976, as I said. And initially, we have a little bit of confusion here around the dates. So the I suppose accepted dates is that sometime between August 18th and August 20th, 1976, which is the second night of their camping trip. One or more of the four guys, and there's going to be a little bit of this throughout where there's a little bit of uncertainty about who said what, but we'll say one or more noticed a strange bright object in the night sky. And they said that it was as bright as the sun, actually, and that's what stood out to them. It's not the moon, just to point out. And they said that this light was visible for about 30 seconds before it vanished. I suppose this initial sighting for them was strange, but allegedly the group just kind of shrugged it off, and they attributed the incident to some sort of shooting star, or perhaps a distant aircraft. They didn't really kind of think too much of it, and I suppose unless you have some other point of reference, it's probably not something that would occur to you as anything other than, oh, that's a bit weird, and just kind of move on from it. So at that point, they apparently went back to bed, didn't talk about it any further. And I suppose now with hindsight, we can see that this encounter, or whatever you want to call it, is probably the precursor to what unfolded afterwards. But at the time, they had no idea. So the main incident then, and what this is known for, took place 2 nights later. And it's during a nighttime fishing trip on Eagle Lake. So the general agreed date is that it happened on the 20th of August. And the men set out after dusk in their canoe and to basically try their luck at some sort of night fishing, which, it's a dangerous enough thing to do, but, it's guys being dudes. They want to do some different shit, and this is what they're into, so night fishing it is. Now, crucially, they did light a bonfire on the shore before they left to operate as some sort of beacon to find their way back, because, as I said before, they're effectively in near total darkness, so they need something to be able to see and navigate back to. And as they were out on the lake, they became aware of this hovering, pulsating object directly above the tree line. And they said that the light that it was emitting was this multicolored sort of light that appeared, what they described as this kind of like light show, effectively, like it was kind of pulsating and going between different lights. For anyone that's seen Close Encounters of the Third Kind, that's the lights from those craft is kind of what I have in my head. It may not be the case, but that's what I have. They said that the object was completely silent, and they said that they felt it was intelligently controlled. So Chuck recounted this sudden sense of being watched. He said he didn't know, it just kind of came out of nowhere. And he said that he felt this before he and the rest of the group actually even saw the craft. He said that it was initially first this hovering bright sphere, and then it transformed into this oval object that seemed to exhibit this kind of gyroscopic motion, and that it effectively moved across, this kind of energy was emanating from it and seemed to kind of moving across the surface of the object. So it kind of seems to be almost like it's pulsating in some way. And as the men, I suppose, shone a torch at the object, its behavior changed abruptly. They said at this point, as soon as the torchlight hit it, that the craft approached and emitted this brilliant beam of light directly on them. And it seemed to basically like fixate down on their canoe. So this is probably the worst possible circumstance for this to happen. You're out in the middle of a lake, night fishing. You're in the middle of this lake. Land is not close to you, and now all of a sudden you have a craft hovering over you. You literally have nowhere to escape to unless you're trying to get in the water. So obviously panic immediately ensues from this, and the four men began paddling quite desperately back to shore for all accounts. But the beam coming from the craft just moved with them. They said that the light at one point was engulfing the canoe, which I can't imagine how terrifying it must feel, especially in total darkness, all of a sudden have this light shining on you. And the next thing any of them remembered was being at the campfire. And I suppose the crucial thing about this is they built up this campfire before they left to go about their business fishing. The next thing they remember is standing beside this campfire, and it's burnt down to embers. And this is where I suppose the first serious strangeness starts happening. So they felt like they were only on the lake for about 20 minutes. However, the fire in front of them and the state of it suggested that several hours had potentially passed. So this, I suppose, missing time element, it's like a classic UFO, I suppose, trope almost. But this missing time event would become a core element to this case. And all the men shared this experience. They all experienced confusion around it, how they got back to shore, and they have absolutely no memory of paddling the final distance. Allegedly after this, none of them really spoke. They said that they felt exhausted and unsettled and basically just wanted to go to bed. So without any other sort of incident happening that night, they just went to bed, slept, and apparently for the rest of their trip, nothing else happened. So fast forward some time then. So after they got back, the group told the story to their family and friends, and for some period of time, it did seem to kind of just fade into the background of their lives. They just went about their business, didn't think much of it, and pretty much just resumed normal student life. And this was really the case until really the late 1980s, so over 10 years later. Disturbing nightmares and then psychological effects began to haunt Jim and Jack, the two brothers in particular. And they started to report these dreams being very vivid and traumatic. They said that they, in their dreams, felt like they were being restrained, that they were being like poked and prodded with devices, and that I suppose at the climax of the dream, they were being confronted by beings, and they said that these beings had large heads with black eyes, and that the overall setting of where they were, it felt clinical, and went a step further than to say that it felt otherworldly. And yeah, the others did also share some of these dreams, but from what I can see, they were nowhere near as, I suppose, effective as they were with Jim and Jack. Like they were really affecting them in some manner, whereas the other two guys seemingly weren't as bad, but were still experiencing something. So these nightmares and I suppose the psychological trauma that it was bringing with it prompted the group to seek help. And this is where I might lose some of you, and I kind of lose myself a little bit as well, but the group found a UFO researcher and a hypnotherapist. His name was Dr. Raymond Fowler, and yeah, they contacted him, and basically over a series of sessions in 1988, each of the four men underwent regressive hypnosis. And this regressive hypnosis was quite popular in the 1980s, especially around like stories of abduction and things like that. You have very, very famous cases like Betty and Barney Hill and things like that. So that does talk about regressive hypnosis. So it really, really was quite a popular thing at the time. And I suppose it was accepted science at this point. It's not as accepted now, but we'll glance over that for the moment. So under this hypnosis, the men recovered, and I say recovered in air quotes, memories of being floated or brought onto a craft. They allegedly each said that they remember being separated from one another and that they were subjected to medical experimentation by these grey-skinned beings with prominent black almond-shaped eyes, and effectively the grey alien motif that we all know now. That this is what they described. And despite kind of, I suppose, minor variations in their stories, from what I can see, their testimonies are reasonably consistent that both skeptics and believers did take some notice in this. And I suppose the detailed accounts from the men and I suppose how linked they were, combined with the shared missing time and then I suppose the physical effects that this had on them afterwards, it kind of forms the backbone of the whole fame that this incident brought to them. So while the abductions didn't result in any sort of formal government investigation, unlike what I mentioned before, the Betty and Barney Hill incident, which we will talk about in a full episode, the story has kind of been dissected by numerous UFO researchers, and it's been featured in numerous books. There's been documentaries, television shows, and as I said, podcasts. Everything basically has been done talking about this. And Dr. Fowler's detailed study and book actually became some sort of like canonical reference to this. And yeah, kind of everything spiraled from this then, like media coverage. There's been still kind of ongoing debate and things like that. Some of the men have actually come out since and publicly retracted what they said or tried to reinterpret what they perhaps might have said during hypnosis. And that has actually kind of added more complexity and controversy to the case. And it's kind of left the story in this weird sort of limbo now where we're not really sure who believes what, who is sticking with the story that they initially said, and who has kind of tried to move away from it. And yeah, it's just this really kind of, I suppose, captivating story where, as I said, there's a period of time that definitely passes where these men seemingly tried to lead normal enough lives, and then we're kind of pulled back into it due to these shared experiences that they had. So I managed to find some quotes across the board from the four of them that were there, and I'll just give you a flavor of what some of them were saying. So Jack Weiner, one of the brothers, he says, the eyes of those beings were the last thing I remembered before I blacked out. They told me not to be afraid and to do what they said, but I couldn't move my body. I felt like an animal on a lab table. We knew something had happened, but none of us could remember what it was. Jim then going on then, he talks about how there was, I suppose, uncertainty about the fire. People claimed about the fire, like, oh, you know, maybe you just didn't build it enough. He says, we built that fire with logs the size of my leg. There's no way it should have burned to embers that quickly, unless we were gone longer than it felt. And then talking about his experience in the craft as well, he says, I was lying on a table in a bright room. These beings were around me. Their heads were huge, their eyes black. I could not move a muscle, but I felt everything as they ran something over my body. Charlie then, who we've talked about, his experience, he says, it was like a doctor's office. I was lying on this table. There was a curved panel over my chest, and I remember them scraping skin from my body. I thought I was going to die on that table. And then finally, Chuck. I saw what the aliens were doing to Charlie. The device they used was silver and had curves. He looked like he was in pain, and there wasn't anything I could do. So, like, they're all kind of consistent in what they're saying. Like, they all talk about different things. They talk about being separated, being on their own. I know Chuck says that Charlie, obviously, he could see him being experimented on, but I think he's still kind of removed from him. So I think it's this consistency is what really kind of gave the case any sort of credence, I suppose. So to really kind of just conclude it all, I'll go into some theories. There's obviously the paranormal side. So a lot of people say that this is direct evidence of a genuine extraterrestrial abduction. You've got multiple consistent witnesses, the missing time and the physical evidence around the fire, this shared trauma, and then the symptoms that kind of came out of that. Allegedly, the descriptions were very, very similar of the beings that they saw. And I think a lot of people point to there being no clear motivation for fabricating these sort of lies, because the group didn't seek any sort of public or financial gain for like years after this. Now, some have now pointed out that they have made money since, and that's absolutely fair. But for quite a period of time, there was no talk of this at all, which I just find quite interesting. I suppose then looking into some of the scientific or skeptical theories, then there's a number of theories that have been put forward, as you'd expect. So some people have suggested that there could be some sort of sleep paralysis going on here, or some sort of hallucination. That, yeah, it's a potentially sleep paralysis could be leading to this feeling among them, especially in this isolated area that they were in, that maybe the light that they did see on the first night was actually just an aircraft or something like that, and it put all of them at unease, and it could have potentially spiraled into this much bigger problem. that they've all kind of potentially conjured for themselves and have kind of fed into. Another one talked about hypnosis-induced false memories and contamination, and this is the one where I think the whole hypnosis thing really divides people. And as I said, you either lose people with this or you don't. So hypnosis, there's a scientific explanation here that says that hypnosis inherently is suggestible in nature, and that hypnotic regression as some sort of memory retrieval method is incredibly unhelpful. It can apparently actually induce false memories in people and conflate dreams with reality, and even kind of generate entirely new narratives for these people that just didn't happen. And Dr. Fowler himself even apparently admitted at a later point that hypnotic regression may introduce or reinforce false memories. So the guy himself who did it is actually saying, like, yeah, it can happen. And yeah, it's a really interesting area, and maybe we'll talk about it at some other point, but a lot of people put a lot of weight into the hypnotic regression, and then a lot of people also point to hypnotic regression being the reason why this couldn't have happened. And I just find it very, very, very interesting. And yeah, one final piece on the scientific skeptic side, I suppose, is a park ranger actually at the time suggested that the men might have actually observed light from a spotlight from a town that was about 70 miles away. So something around, it could have been potentially bouncing off the clouds at night, and because it's such a dark sky area that it could have been quite visible. The men disagreed with this, but I just found it interesting that, you know, people were putting a lot of thought into what this could have potentially been, and I could potentially see a light being misunderstood as something else, even on the first night, as being misunderstood and causing them, if we are talking about the kind of spiraling thoughts, it could definitely set it off or act as some sort of primer. So, you know, I don't see why it's any different to any other theory that's out there. But yeah, that's kind of where we are. You know, I don't really want to get into the later stuff where they've kind of had a bit of infighting and things like that. I just want to talk about the main story itself. But I'd strongly suggest that if people are interested in this, they look into it further, because it's a super, super interesting story. Like, there's some really, really great sources out there. So I would strongly recommend reading into this more if you are interested. I'd love to know where you come down on this. Do you think that this potentially could have happened, or do you think that it is just a fabrication that has kind of grown legs and run on itself? Yeah, I really don't know myself. I'd love to hear from you. You can get us on social media at Threads or Instagram at the SpookyFPod. You can get us on YouTube in the comments there when this episode goes up, or you can send us an email at thespookafpodcast@gmail.com. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. But with that said, I hope you're having a lovely day whenever it is you're listening to this, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take it easy, guys.